My husband insulted my family, saying I came from nothing. His face turned ghostly white when my mother's private jet landed, carrying a team of lawyers ready to take back everything. I-28F, never thought I'd be writing this, but here I am, sitting in what used to be our shared apartment, watching my soon-to-be ex-husband pack his belongings into cardboard boxes. The irony isn't lost on me that he's using boxes from the moving company my family owns. Let me start from the beginning. 3 years ago, I met him at a coffee shop near my office. I was working as a junior marketing coordinator, deliberately keeping my background quiet. Growing up wealthy taught me early that people's motivations change dramatically when they discover your family's net worth. So I lived modestly, drove a used Honda, and split bills 50-50 like any normal couple. He seemed perfect. Ambitious, charming, working his way up at a mid-tier consulting firm. We moved in together after 8 months, got married after 2 years. I thought I'd found someone who loved me for who I was, not what my family had. The cracks started showing during our first year of marriage. Small comments about my simple upbringing. How I never talked about my family's business. How my parents seemed distant during our wedding video calls. I brushed it off, thinking he was just curious about my reserved nature regarding family matters. Then came last month's company dinner. His firm was celebrating a major client acquisition, and spouses were invited. I wore a simple black dress, nothing flashy. During dinner, his colleague mentioned how his wife's family had connections that helped land him a better position. That's when my husband decided to share his thoughts about my background. He told the entire table how refreshing it was to be with someone who came from nothing, unlike his previous girlfriend whose family money made her entitled. He explained how I understood the value of hard work because my family never had anything to give me. How I was self-made, unlike those spoiled rich kids who never earned anything themselves. I sat there, fork halfway to my mouth, watching him paint this elaborate picture of my humble origins. His colleagues nodded approvingly, praising him for choosing substance over status. One even joked about how smart he was to avoid gold diggers. The worst part wasn't the lies. It was the condescending tone, the way he spoke about people like me, as if we were a different species he'd graciously decided to study. The way he described my family as simple, hard-working folks who did their best with limited resources. I excused myself to the bathroom and called my mother. She answered on the first ring, probably expecting our usual weekly check-in. Instead, I found myself crying into the phone, telling her everything. About the lies, the condescension, the way he'd constructed this entire narrative about my background without ever asking me directly about my family situation. My mother listened quietly. When I finished, she asked one simple question. Did I want her help? I said yes. She told me she'd handle everything and that I should act normal for the next few days. She also mentioned that she'd been wondering when I'd finally let her meet my husband properly, since our wedding had been small and mostly virtual due to timing conflicts. I went back to the dinner table and smiled through the rest of the evening. My husband continued his performance, occasionally patting my hand while explaining to his colleagues how lucky he felt to have found someone so grounded and unpretentious. That night, I told him my mother wanted to visit next weekend. She was planning to fly in and finally meet him face to face. He seemed pleased, probably expecting to meet the simple working-class woman he'd described to his colleagues. The next morning, I called in sick to work and spent the day with my lawyer. Not the family lawyer, my personal attorney who'd been handling my affairs since college. We discussed asset protection, prenuptial agreement enforcement, and the legal implications of financial misrepresentation in marriage. See, here's what my husband never knew. I had been completely honest about my background. I just never elaborated. When he asked about my family's business, I said they were in logistics and transportation. True, they own the third largest shipping and logistics company on the East Coast. When he asked about my childhood, I said we lived comfortably. Also true, our comfortable home was a 12-bedroom estate with staff quarters. I never lied. I just never corrected his assumptions. My lawyer explained that while his public misrepresentation of my background wasn't grounds for divorce, his financial behavior during our marriage was problematic. Apparently, making major financial decisions based on false assumptions about your spouse's family wealth could complicate asset division. Friday afternoon, my husband came home excited about meeting my mother. He'd even bought flowers and planned to take her to a nice restaurant in town. He kept asking what she was like, what she did for work, whether she'd be impressed by our apartment. I told him she was looking forward to meeting him too. Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzly. My husband had taken the day off work and was nervously cleaning our already clean apartment. He changed clothes 3 times, settling on khakis and a button-down shirt that he thought struck the right balance between respectful and casual. Around noon, I got a text from my mother saying she'd landed and would be over shortly. My husband positioned himself by the window, watching for a taxi or rideshare car. He kept asking what kind of car my mother drove, whether she'd need help with directions, if she was comfortable navigating city traffic. 20 minutes later, he called out that there was some kind of commotion outside. A black SUV had pulled up, followed by another one. Men in suits were getting out, looking around the neighborhood like they were assessing security. Then the private jet flew overhead. I watched my husband's face as he tracked the aircraft's path toward the small regional airport 15 minutes away. His expression shifted from curiosity to confusion to something approaching concern. 30 minutes later, another black SUV arrived. This one was different, longer, more expensive looking. My mother stepped out wearing a tailored coat that probably cost more than our monthly rent. Behind her emerged 2 men in expensive suits carrying briefcases. My husband turned to me with a look I'd never seen before. He asked who those people were, why they were coming to our building, whether I knew anything about the jet he'd seen. I told him my mother had arrived. The color drained from his face as he processed this information. He started asking rapid-fire questions about who the men were, why there were multiple cars, whether this was normal for my family. The doorbell rang. I buzzed them up while my husband stood frozen in our living room, still holding the flowers he'd bought. I could hear multiple sets of footsteps on the stairs, professional voices discussing logistics and timing. When I opened the door, my mother smiled and hugged me like she always did. She was elegant, composed, and completely in control of the situation. Behind her stood her personal attorney and the head of our family's legal department. She introduced herself to my husband using her full name and title. I watched his face as he processed the information, probably running quick internet searches in his head, trying to place where he'd heard our family name before. Then she mentioned that she'd brought some paperwork for us to review together. Legal documents that might help clarify some recent misunderstandings about our family's business interests. My husband's hands were shaking as he offered her the flowers. My mother accepted them graciously, then suggested we all sit down for a conversation. She'd heard so much about him, she said, and was particularly interested in his thoughts about family backgrounds and their importance in marriage. The lead attorney opened his briefcase and began laying out documents on our coffee table. Asset reports, business valuations, trust fund statements, and property deeds. Each page represented another zero in my family's net worth, another business acquisition, another investment portfolio. My husband sat down heavily, staring at the papers spread before him. His face had gone completely white, and I could see sweat forming on his forehead despite the cool temperature in our apartment. My mother began explaining our family's business history in the same calm tone she used for board meetings. How my great-grandfather had started with a single delivery truck. How each generation had expanded the operation. How they now employed over 15,000 people across multiple states. She mentioned that she'd been looking forward to welcoming him into the family properly, but had been concerned by some recent information that had come to her attention. Information about public statements he'd made regarding my background and our family's circumstances. The attorney pulled out a tablet and began playing audio recordings from the company dinner. Apparently, one of his colleagues had posted videos on social media, capturing my husband's entire speech about my humble origins and his preference for women who came from nothing. I watched my husband's face as he heard his own voice describing my family as simple people with limited resources. His eyes darted between the legal documents showing our family's wealth and the tablet playing his words back to him. My mother asked if he'd like to clarify any misunderstandings about our family's situation. He started stammering apologies, claiming he'd been misunderstood, that he'd never meant to misrepresent anything. He insisted he'd always known I came from a successful family, that he'd just been trying to emphasize my personal work ethic. The attorney pulled out printed transcripts of the dinner conversation, highlighting specific quotes. My husband's claim that my family never had anything to give me. His statement that I understood hard work because I came from nothing. His joke about avoiding spoiled rich kids. My mother listened to his explanations with the same polite attention she gave to business presentations she was about to reject. Then she explained why she'd brought the legal team. Apparently, my husband had been making financial decisions throughout our marriage based on his assumptions about my family's wealth, or lack thereof. He'd insisted on keeping our finances completely separate, refusing to consider joint investments or shared financial planning. He'd turned down opportunities that he thought were beyond our means, including a house my parents had offered to help us purchase. More problematically, he'd been positioning himself at work as someone who'd married beneath his social class, using this narrative to build relationships with colleagues and superiors who appreciated his grounded choice in partners. The legal team had documentation of these professional conversations, including emails where he'd referenced his wife's humble background as evidence of his character and values. My mother explained that this pattern of behavior constituted a form of financial fraud within our marriage. He'd been making decisions and building professional relationships based on false information, potentially impacting both our financial future and my reputation. The attorneys began outlining the legal implications of his misrepresentations, how his public statements could be considered defamatory to our family's business reputation, how his financial decisions based on false assumptions had created complications for asset division in case of divorce. They also mentioned that several of his colleagues had reached out to our family's business development team after the dinner, offering their services based on their assumption that we were a small, local operation that might need consulting help. My husband tried to interrupt, claiming this was all a misunderstanding, that he'd never intended any harm. He insisted he loved me regardless of my family's wealth, that money had never mattered to him. My mother asked why, if money didn't matter, he'd spent so much time publicly discussing my supposed lack of it. The room fell silent except for the sound of papers being organized and briefcases being closed. Then my mother made her offer. He could sign the divorce papers her attorneys had prepared, which included a fair but limited settlement based on our prenuptial agreement. In exchange, our family would not pursue legal action for defamation or fraud. He would also agree to correct his public statements about my background and issue appropriate apologies to his colleagues and company. Or he could contest the divorce and face a legal battle against a team of attorneys who specialized in protecting high-net-worth families from exactly this type of situation. She gave him 24 hours to decide. My husband looked at me desperately, asking if this was really what I wanted, whether we could work things out privately, if I was really willing to throw away our marriage over a misunderstanding. I told him this wasn't about the money. It was about the fact that he'd built our entire relationship on assumptions he'd never bothered to verify. That he'd been comfortable describing my family in demeaning terms without ever asking about our actual circumstances. That he'd used his perception of my humble background to enhance his own image professionally and socially. Most importantly, it was about the realization that he'd fallen in love with a version of me that didn't exist. The hard-working girl from nothing who made him feel noble and grounded. Not the actual person I was. Update 1. He signed the papers Sunday morning. The divorce was finalized within 6 weeks, thanks to our ironclad prenuptial agreement and his desire to avoid a prolonged legal battle. He moved out immediately, taking only his personal belongings and the settlement amount specified in our prenup. His colleagues at the consulting firm were initially confused by his sudden change in narrative about my background. When he tried to explain that he'd been mistaken about my family's circumstances, several of them felt deceived by his previous stories. His professional relationships, which he'd built partly on his image as someone who'd chosen substance over status, became strained. The company dinner incident became office gossip, especially after someone connected the dots between my family name and the logistics company that had recently acquired one of their major clients. His credibility took a significant hit, and he ended up leaving the firm 3 months later. Update 2. 6 months after the divorce, I moved back home temporarily while deciding on my next steps. My mother and I had long conversations about why I'd hidden my background for so long, and she helped me understand that while protecting myself from gold diggers was smart, completely concealing my identity had created its own problems. I realized I'd been so focused on finding someone who loved me for myself that I'd never given anyone the chance to love all of me, including my family and background. My ex-husband tried to contact me several times through mutual friends, claiming he wanted to apologize and explain that he could love me regardless of my family's wealth. But his messages always seemed to focus on how he'd been deceived, rather than acknowledging how his assumptions and public statements had hurt me. Update 3. A year later, I'm in a much better place. I've started being more open about my background in new relationships, finding a balance between protecting myself and being honest about who I am. I've also gotten more involved in the family business, using my marketing experience to help modernize our public relations approach. My mother occasionally mentions that the private jet and legal team entrance was probably overkill, but she doesn't regret making a point. She says sometimes people need dramatic demonstrations to understand the magnitude of their mistakes. As for my ex-husband, I heard through mutual connections that he's dating someone new. According to friends, he's been very careful to thoroughly research her family background before making any public statements about her upbringing. I suppose that's progress in its own way. Looking back, I don't regret how things ended. The marriage was built on a fundamental misunderstanding of who I was, and his reaction to learning the truth showed me everything I needed to know about his character. Someone who truly loved me would have been curious about my family, not comfortable making assumptions and broadcasting them to colleagues. The whole experience taught me that honesty in relationships goes both ways. I can't expect someone to love the real me if I'm not willing to show them who that actually is. But I also learned that how someone reacts to unexpected information about you reveals their true character. My mother was right to bring the lawyers. Not because we needed legal protection, but because dramatic situations reveal people's authentic selves. When faced with the reality of my family's wealth and influence, my ex-husband's first concern wasn't how his assumptions had hurt me, it was how the situation affected his image and prospects. That told me everything I needed to know about who he really was, and who he'd always been. Sometimes the most important revelations come not from what people say when they think they know everything about you, but from what they do when they realize they knew nothing at all.